The jacket in winter. The cold that afternoon was not merely a temperature. It was a physical presence. It bit at exposed skin, froze the dampness in the air, and turned the city into a brittle gray landscape of ice and exhaust. Noah Miller was 10 years old, bundled so tightly into his new winter coat that he could barely bend his arms. The jacket was a heavy, dark green fortress of water-resistant nylon, insulated with thick down, featuring a heavy brass zipper and a soft flannel lining woven in a red and black plaid. His mother, Clara, had worked a double shift at the clinic just to afford it. She gripped his hand as they leaned into the biting wind, hurrying down the pavement toward the warmth of their apartment. Through the squint of his watering eyes, Noah noticed the man on the bus stop bench. People were walking past the bench rapidly, keeping their heads down, locked in their own private battles with the freezing air. But Noah slowed. The man was not asking for money. He wasn't speaking at all. He wore a threadbare gray sweater over a faded collared shirt, his legs clad in thin denim. His arms were wrapped around his torso, his shoulders shaking in violent, involuntary spasms. He had surrendered to the cold, his chin resting on his chest, a dusting of white frost gathering in his dark, unkempt beard. Noah stopped walking. Clara tugged gently at his arm. "Come on, Noah. We can't stop. It's freezing." "He doesn't have a coat," Noah said, his voice muffled by his woolen scarf. "I know, sweetheart," Clara said softly, her eyes flashing with a familiar, helpless sadness. "But we have to get home." Noah didn't move. He looked at the man, and for a fleeting second the man looked back. His eyes were a pale, striking blue. They were not angry or unhinged, only utterly and completely defeated. In that gaze, Noah did not see a stranger. He saw a human being actively slipping away. Without a word, Noah reached for the brass zipper at his chin and pulled it down. "Noah, what are you doing?" Clara asked, her voice sharp with sudden alarm. "You'll freeze." "I'm almost home," Noah said. He slipped his left arm out of the thick green sleeve, then his right. The biting wind immediately slashed through his thin school sweater, stealing his breath, but he stepped forward and held the jacket out to the man. Clara stood frozen for a moment. She knew the cost of that coat. She knew the hours she had spent on her feet to buy it. Yet, as she looked at her son holding out his prized possession in the freezing wind, and then at the man shivering on the bench, her shoulders softened. She stepped forward, took off her own thick wool shawl, and wrapped it tightly around Noah's shoulders. The man looked at the green jacket, then up at Noah. His trembling hands hesitated. "For me?" the man whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "It's very warm," Noah said. The man reached out and took it. He clutched the heavy nylon to his chest like a lifeline. He looked at Clara, offering a silent, shattered expression of gratitude, and then he looked back at the boy. Noah offered a small smile, turned, and walked away with his mother, hurried along by the brutal winter wind. The memory of that afternoon settled into the foundation of Noah's life, becoming a silent touchstone that guided him long after the jacket itself was forgotten. Time moved with its usual quiet speed. The years blurred into high school, then university. Noah grew into a thoughtful, broad-shouldered man in his mid-20s. He had developed a profound fascination with environments, how spaces held people, how walls and greenery could either isolate a person or make them feel safe. He became a landscape architect, specializing in therapeutic gardens and public sanctuaries. He believed in designing places that welcomed the weary. It was this philosophy that brought him to the home of Jonathan Wright. Jonathan was a wealthy, private man in his 60s, an executive who had spent his life accumulating resources and shielding himself behind high walls. He had hired Noah to completely redesign the sprawling, neglected acreage behind his large stone house on the edge of the city. During their initial meetings, Jonathan was stern and uncompromising. He wanted high hedges, secure gates, and a very specific layout. "It's not for me," Jonathan explained one afternoon as they stood in the drafty sunroom overlooking the barren yard. "It is for my brother. He is coming to live with me soon. He needs a place to walk where the world cannot rush in." He needs absolute peace. Over the following weeks, as Noah drafted layouts of winding stone paths, water features, and sheltered seating areas, Jonathan slowly revealed fragments of his brother's life. His brother's name was Samuel. Years ago, Samuel had been a brilliant structural engineer. He understood how to hold massive weights, how to distribute pressure so that buildings wouldn't collapse. But 15 years earlier, Samuel's wife and young son were killed in a horrific highway collision. Samuel's internal foundation had simply given way. Unable to cope with the silence of an empty house, consumed by a grief so heavy it fractured his sense of reality, Samuel had walked out of his firm. He left his keys on the counter, walked into the city, and vanished. For 8 years, I didn't know if he was dead or alive, Jonathan said, staring out the glass at the dead autumn leaves. He lived on the streets. I hired investigators, I walked through shelters, but he didn't want to be found. He stripped himself of his identity. He believed he didn't deserve a name, a home, or a brother, because he couldn't protect his own family. Noah listened quietly, moved by the profound ache in the older man's voice. He adjusted his designs, adding softer curves to the pathways, choosing deep-rooted, enduring trees like oak and cedar, trees that offered shelter and permanence. Late November arrived, bringing the first hard frost of the season. The air turned bitter, carrying the metallic scent of impending snow. Noah was working late at Jonathan's house, finalizing the blueprints on the dining room table. When it was time to leave, he walked into the dimly lit mudroom to retrieve his wool overcoat from the closet. He opened the heavy wooden door and reached into the darkness. His hand brushed against something thick and synthetic. It slipped off its hanger and fell to the floor with the muted, heavy thud of brass and down. Noah bent to pick it up. As his fingers wrapped around the dark green nylon, his breath caught in his throat. He stood up, holding the garment under the pale light of the hallway sconce. It was a boy's winter coat. It was incredibly worn, the cuffs frayed, the dark green fabric stained and patched in several places. But the brass zipper was unmistakable, and as Noah slowly folded back the collar, he saw the red and black plaid flannel lining. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. With trembling fingers, he checked the inner collar. There, on a faded white laundry tag, written in Clara's neat, enduring permanent marker, were 2 words, End Miller. You're looking at my brother's most prized possession. Noah turned. Jonathan was standing in the doorway, his posture relaxed but his eyes heavy with emotion. I don't understand, Noah whispered, holding the jacket. Jonathan stepped into the room. When Samuel finally called me, it was the dead of winter. He was in a diner, wrapped in a blanket and clutching that little coat. He told me that the night before, he had made up his mind to die. He sat on a bench and stopped fighting the cold. He was just waiting to fall asleep. Jonathan's voice thickened, and he looked at the small green coat in Noah's hands. He told me a little boy stopped. A boy took the coat off his own back and gave it to him. Samuel couldn't wear it, of course. It was far too small. But he draped it over his shoulders and held it against his chest. The down feathers held the boy's body heat for a few minutes. But Samuel said it wasn't the heat that kept him alive. It was the absolute shock that a child cared whether he lived or died. Noah stared at the fraying fabric, the memory of the biting wind and the man with the pale blue eyes rushing back with dizzying clarity. It reminded Samuel of his own son, Jonathan continued quietly. It shattered the wall of isolation he had built around himself. The sheer grace of that act woke him up. It gave him the strength to survive the night, and the courage to walk into a diner the next morning and ask for a quarter to call me. Jonathan looked up at Noah, his brow furrowing as he noticed the stunned, tear-filled expression on the younger man's face. Footsteps sounded slowly on the hardwood floor of the adjoining hallway. A man stepped into the light. He was in his late 50s now. His hair was silver, neatly trimmed, and he wore a thick wool sweater. His face was mapped with the deep, permanent lines of a harsh life weathered in the elements, but his posture was upright. He carried a tray with 2 mugs of tea. Noah couldn't breathe. He recognized the eyes. They were the same striking, pale blue, but they were no longer defeated. They were clear, calm, and grounded. Samuel Wright stopped. He looked at the young architect holding the small green jacket. He looked at Noah's face, tracing the lines of his jaw, the shape of his brow. For several long seconds, the only sound in the house was the rhythmic ticking of the radiator. Slowly, Samuel set the tray down on a side table. His hands, bearing the faint scars of years spent in the cold, trembled slightly. "You told me," Samuel whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming emotion, "that you were almost home." Noah nodded slowly, a tear escaping and tracking down his cheek. "I was." Samuel took a step forward, closing the distance between them. He reached out and gently rested his hand over Noah's, right over the worn nylon of the jacket. The touch bridged a gap of 15 years, a silent testament to the fragile, invisible threads that bind human lives together. "I realized I wasn't," Samuel said, a gentle, broken smile touching his lips. "So I decided to find my way back." They stood together in the quiet warmth of the old house, two men from entirely different worlds, anchored by a faded piece of fabric. Outside, the winter wind howled against the heavy stone walls, but inside, the air was still and secure. Noah looked out the window toward the dark expanse of the yard, where in just a few months, the frost would thaw, the earth would soften, and the enduring trees he had designed for a lost man would finally begin to take root.